The DHARMA BUMS by Jack Kerouac. Chapter 1. Hopping a freight out of Los Angeles at high noon one day in late September 1955, I got on a gondola and lay down with my duffel bag under my head and my knees crossed and contemplated the clouds as we rolled north to Santa Barbara. It was a local, and I intended to sleep on the beach at Santa Barbara that night and catch either another local to San Luis Obispo the next morning or the first-class freight all the way to San Francisco at 7 p.m. Somewhere near Camarillo, where Charlie Parker had been mad and relaxed back to normal health, a thin old little bum climbed into my gondola as we headed into a siding to give a train right of way and looked surprised to see me there. He established himself at the other end of the gondola and lay down, facing me, with his head on his own miserably small pack, and said nothing. By and by they blew the highway whistle after the eastbound freight had smashed through on the main line, and we pulled out as the air got colder and fog began to blow from the sea over the warm valleys of the coast. Both the little bum and I, after unsuccessful attempts to huddle on the cold steel in wraparounds, got up and paced back and forth and jumped and flapped arms at each other our end of the gon. Pretty soon we headed into another siding at a small railroad town, and I figured I needed a poor boy of Tokay wine to complete the cold dusk run to Santa Barbara. Will you watch my pack while I run over and get a bottle of wine? Sure thing. I jumped over the side and ran across Highway 101 to the store and bought, besides wine, a little bread and candy. I ran back to my freight train, which had another 15 minutes to wait in the now warm sunny scene. But it was late afternoon and bound to get cold. The little bum was sitting cross-legged at his end before a pitiful repast of one can of sardines. I took pity on him and went over and said, "How about a little wine to warm you up? Maybe you'd like some bread and cheese with your sardines." "Sure thing." He spoke from far away inside a little meek voice box, afraid or unwilling to assert himself. "I'd bought the cheese 3 days ago in Mexico, before the long cheap bus trip across Zacatecas and Durango and Chihuahua. 2,000 long miles to the border at El Paso." He ate the cheese and bread and drank the wine with gusto and gratitude. I was pleased. I reminded myself of the line in the Diamond Sutra that says, "Practice charity without holding in mind any conceptions about charity, for charity, after all, is just a word." I was very devout in those days and was practicing my religious devotions almost to perfection. Since then, I've become a little hypocritical about my lip service and a little tired and cynical, because now I'm grown so old and neutral. But then I really believed in the reality of charity and kindness and humility and zeal and neutral tranquility and wisdom and ecstasy. And I believed that I was an old-time Bhikkhu in modern clothes, wandering the world, usually the immense triangular arc of New York to Mexico City to San Francisco, in order to turn the wheel of the true meaning, or Dharma, and gain merit for myself as a future Buddha awakener, and as a future hero in paradise. I had not met Jaffe Ryder yet. I was about to the next week, or heard anything about Dharma bums. although at this time I was a perfect Dharma bum myself and considered myself a religious wanderer. The little bum in the gondola solidified all my beliefs by warming up to the wine and talking, and finally whipping out a tiny slip of paper which contained a prayer by Saint Teresa, announcing that after her death she will return to the earth by showering it with roses from heaven, forever for all living creatures. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Oh, I cut it out of a reading room magazine in Los Angeles a couple of years ago. I always carry it with me." "And you squat in boxcars and read it?" "Most every day." He talked not much more than this, didn't amplify on the subject of St. Teresa, and was very modest about his religion, and told me little about his personal life. He is the kind of thin, quiet little bum nobody pays much attention to, even in Skid Row, let alone Main Street. If a cop hustled him off, he hustled and disappeared, and if yard dicks were around in the big city yards when a freight was pulling out, chances are they never got a sight of the little man hiding in the weeds and hopping on in the shadows. When I told him I was planning to hop the Zipper first class freight train the next night, he said, "Ah, you mean the Midnight Ghost." "Is that what you call the Zipper? You must be a railroad man on that railroad." I was a brakeman on the SP. "Well, we bums call it the Midnight Ghost, 'cause you get on it at LA, and nobody sees you till you get to San Francisco in the morning. The thing flies so fast." 80 miles an hour on the straightaways, pap." "That's right, but it gets mighty cold at night when you're flying up the coast north of Gaviotti and up around Surf." "Surf, that's right. Then the mountains down south of Margarita." "Margarita, that's right. But I've rid that Midnight Ghost more times than I can count, I guess." "How many years since you've been home?" "More years than I care to count, I guess. Ohio was where I was from." But the train got started, the wind grew cold and foggy again, and we spent the following hour and a half doing everything in our power and will not to freeze and chatter teeth too much. I'd huddle and meditate on the warmth, the actual warmth of God, to obviate the cold. Then I'd jump up and flap my arms and legs and sing. But the little bum had more patience than I had, and just lay there most of the time, chewing his cud in forlorn, bitter-lipped thought. My teeth were chattering, my lips blue. By dark we saw the relief, the familiar mountains of Santa Barbara taking shape, and soon we'd be stopped and warm in the warm starlight night by the tracks. I bade farewell to the little bum of St. Teresa at the crossing, where we jumped off, and went to sleep the night in the sand, in my blankets, far down the beach at the foot of the cliff, where cops wouldn't see me and drive me away. I cooked hot dogs on freshly cut and sharpened sticks over the coals of the big wood fire, and heated a can of beans and a can of cheese macaroni in the red-hot hollows, and drank my newly bought wine, and exulted in one of the most pleasant nights of my life. I waded in the water and dunked a little, and stood looking up at the splendorous night sky. Avalokitesvara's 10 wondered universe of dark and diamonds. "Well, Ray," says I, glad, "only a few miles to go. You've done it again. Happy just in my swim shorts, barefooted, wild-haired, in the red fire dark, singing, swigging wine, spitting, jumping, running. That's the way to live. All alone and free in the soft sands of the beach, by the sigh of the sea out there, with the ma-wink fallopian, virgin warm stars reflecting on the outer channel fluid belly waters. And if your cans are red hot, and you can't hold them in your hands, just use good old railroad gloves, that's all. I let the food cool a little to enjoy more wine and my thoughts. I sat cross-legged in the sand and contemplated my life. Well, there, and what difference did it make? What's going to happen to me up ahead? Then the wine got to work on my taste buds, and before long I had to pitch into those hot dogs, biting them right off the end of the stick spit, and chomp, chomp, and dig down into the 2 tasty cans with the old pack spoon, spooning up rich bites of hot beans and pork, or of macaroni with sizzling hot sauce, and maybe a little sand thrown in. And how many grains of sand are there on this beach, I think? Why, as many grains of sand as there are stars in that sky. Chomp, chomp. And if so, how many human beings have there been? In fact, how many living creatures have there been since before the less part of beginningless time? Why, I reckon you would have to calculate the number of grains of sand on this beach and on every star in the sky in every one of the 10,000 great chilocosms, which would be a number of sand grains uncomputable by IBM and Burroughs too. Why, boy, I don't rightly know. Swig of wine. I don't rightly know, but it must be a couple umpteen trillion sextillion infideled and busted up innumerable number of roses that sweet Saint Teresa and that fine little old man are now this minute showering on your head with lilies. Then, meal done, wiping my lips with my red bandana, I washed up the dishes in the salt sea, kicked a few clods of sand, wandered around, wiped them, put them away, stuck the old spoon back in the salty pack, and lay down curled in my blanket for a night's good and just rest. Waking up in the middle of the night. Wah! Where am I? What is this basketball-y game of eternity the girls are playing here by me in the old house of my life? The house isn't on fire, is it? But it's only the banding rush of waves piling up higher, closer, high tide to my blanket bed. I be as hard as an old as a conch shell. And I go to sleep and dream that while sleeping I use up 3 slices of bread breathing. Ah, poor mind of man, the lonely man alone on the beach, and God watching with intent smile, I'd say. And I dreamed of home, long ago in New England, my little kit-cats trying to go 1,000 miles, following me on the road across America, and my mother with a pack on her back, and my father running after the ephemeral, uncatchable train. And I dreamed and woke up to a gray dawn, saw it, sniffed, because I had seen all the horizon shift as if a shifter had hurried to put it back in place and make me believe in its reality, and went back to sleep turning over. It's all the same thing, I heard my voice say in the void that's highly embraceable during sleep. Chapter 2. The little St. Teresa bum was the first genuine Dharma bum I'd met, and the second was the number 1 Dharma bum of them all, and in fact it was he, Jaffe Ryder, who coined the phrase. Jaffe Ryder was a kid from eastern Oregon, brought up in a log cabin deep in the woods with his father and mother and sister, from the beginning a woods boy, an axeman, farmer, interested in animals and Indian lore, so that when he finally got to college by hook or crook, he was already well equipped for his early studies in anthropology, and later in Indian myth, and in actual texts of Indian mythology. Finally, he learned Chinese and Japanese and became an Oriental scholar and discovered the greatest Dharma bums of them all, the Zen lunatics of China and Japan. At the same time, being a Northwest boy with idealistic tendencies, he got interested in old-fashioned IWW anarchism and learned to play the guitar and sing old worker songs to go with his Indian songs and general folk song interests. I first saw him walking down the street in San Francisco the following week, after hitchhiking the rest of the way from Santa Barbara in one long zipping ride, giving me, as though anybody'll believe this, by a beautiful, darling young blonde in a snow-white strapless bathing suit and barefooted with a gold bracelet on her ankle, driving a next year's cinnamon-red Lincoln Mercury, who wanted Benzedrine so she could drive all the way to the city, and when I said I had some in my duffel bag, yelled crazy. I saw Jaffe lopping along in that curious long stride of the mountain climber, with a small knapsack on his back filled with books and toothbrushes and what not, which was his small going-to-the-city knapsack, as apart from his big full rucksack, complete with sleeping bag, poncho, and cookpots. He wore a little goatee, strangely oriental looking, with his somewhat slanted green eyes, and he didn't look like a bohemian at all, and was far from being a bohemian, a hanger-oner around the arts. He was wiry, suntan, vigorous, open, all howdies, and glad talk, and even yelling hello to bums on the street, and when asked a question, answered right off the bat, from the top or bottom of his mind, I don't know which, and always in a sprightly, sparkling way. "Where did you meet Ray Smith?" they asked him when we walked into the place, the favorite bar of the Hepcoats around the beach. "Oh, I always meet by bodhisattvas in the street," he yelled, and ordered beers. It was a great night, a historic night in more ways than one. He had some other poets. He also wrote poetry and translated Chinese and Japanese poetry into English. We're scheduled to give a poetry reading at the Gallery 6 in town. They were all meeting in the bar and getting high. But as they stood and sat around, I saw that he was the only one who didn't look like a poet, though poet he was indeed. The other poets were either horn-rimmed intellectual hepcats, with wild black hair like Alva Goldbook, or delicate pale handsome poets like Ike O'Shea in a suit, or out-of-this-world genteel-looking Renaissance Italians like Francis de Pavia, who looks like a young priest, or bow-tied, wild-haired, old anarchist fuds like Reinhold Kekothes, or big, fat, bespectacled, quiet boohoos like Warren Kovlin. And all the other hopeful poets were standing around in various costumes, worn at the sleeves, corduroy jackets, scruffy shoes, books sticking out of their pockets. But Jaffe was in rough working man's clothes. He'd bought second-hand in Goodwill stores to serve him on mountain climbs and hikes, and for sitting in the open at night, for campfires, for hitchhiking up and down the coast. In fact, in his little knapsack, he also had a funny green alpine cap that he wore when he got to the foot of a mountain, usually with a yodel, before starting to tromp up a few thousand feet. He wore mountain climbing boots, expensive ones, his pride and joy, Italian make, in which he clumped around over the sawdust floor of the bar like an old-time lumberjack. Jaffe wasn't big, just about 5'7", but strong and wiry and fast and muscular. His face was a mask of woeful bone, but his eyes twinkled like the eyes of old giggling sages of China over that little goatee to offset the rough look of his handsome face. His teeth were a little brown from early backwoods neglect, but you never noticed that, and he opened his mouth wide to guffaw at jokes. Sometimes he'd quiet down and just stare sadly at the floor like a man whittling. He was merry at times. He showed great sympathetic interest in me and in the story about the little St. Teresa bum and the stories I told him about my own experiences hopping freights or hitchhiking or hiking in woods. He claimed at once that I was a great bodhisattva, meaning great wise being or great wise angel, and that I was ornamenting this world with my sincerity. We had the same favorite Buddhist saint, too, Avalokitesvara, or in Japanese, Kwannon, the 11-headed. He knew all the details of Tibetan Chinese, Mahayana, Hinayana, Japanese, and even Burmese Buddhism. But I warned him at once I didn't give a goddamn about the mythology and all the names and national flavors of Buddhism, but was just interested in the first of the Sakyamuni's Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering, and to an extent interested in the third, the suppression of suffering can be achieved, which I didn't quite believe was possible then. I hadn't yet digested the Lankavatara scripture, which eventually shows you that there's nothing in the world but the mind itself, and therefore all's possible, including the suppression of suffering. Jaffe's buddy was the aforementioned boohoo, big old good-hearted Warren Coughlin, 180 pounds of poet meat, who was advertised by Jaffe, privately in my ear, as being more than meets the eye. Who is he? He's my big best friend from up in Oregon. We've known each other a long time. At first you think he's slow and stupid, but actually he's a shining diamond. You'll see. Don't let him cut you to ribbons. He'll make the top of your head fly away, boy, with a choice chance word. Why? He's a great mysterious bodhisattva, I think maybe a reincarnation, of Asagna, the great Mahayana scholar of old centuries. And who am I? I don't know, maybe you're Goat. Goat? Maybe you're Mudface. Who's Mudface? Mudface is the mud in your goat face. What would you say if someone was asked the question, does a dog have the Buddha nature? And said, woof. I'd say that was a lot of silly Zen Buddhism. This took Jaffe back a bit. Listen, Jaffe, I said, I'm not a Zen Buddhist. I'm a serious Buddhist. I'm an old-fashioned, dreamy Hinayana coward of later Mahayanism, and so forth into the night, my contention being that Zen Buddhism didn't concentrate on kindness so much as on confusing the intellect to make it perceive the illusion of all sources of things. It's mean, I complained. All those Zen masters throwing young kids in the mud because they can't answer their silly word questions. That's because they want them to realize mud is better than words, boy. But I can't recreate the exact, will try brilliance of all Jaffe's answers and comebacks and come-ons, and which he had me on pins and needles all the time, and did eventually stick something in my crystal head that made me change my plans in life. Anyway, I followed the whole gang of howling poets to the reading at Gallery 6 that night, which was, among other important things, the night of the birth of the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance. Everyone was there. It was a mad night, and I was the one who got things jumping by going around collecting dimes and quarters from the rather stiff audience standing around in the gallery, and coming back with 3 huge gallon jugs of California Burgundy and getting them all piffed so that by 11 o'clock, when Alva Goldbook was wailing his poem, Whale, Drunk with arms outspread, everybody was yelling, "Go, go, go," like a jam session, and old Reinhold Kakothes, the father of the Frisco poetry scene, was wiping his tears in gladness. Jaffe himself read his fine poems about Coyote, the god of the North American Plateau Indians. I think, at least the god of the Northwest Indians. Quakiotl and what all. "Fuck you," sang Coyote, and ran away. Read Jaffe to the distinguished audience, making them all howl with joy. It was so pure, fuck being a dirty word that comes out clean. And he had his tender lyrical lines like the ones about bears eating berries, showing his love of animals, and great mystery lines about oxen on the Mongolian road, showing his knowledge of Oriental literature, even on the Hasuan Tsung, the great Chinese monk who walked from China to Tibet, Lang Chao to Kashgar, and Mongolia, carrying a stick of incense in his hand. Then Jaffe showed his sudden barroom humor with lines about Coyote bringing goodies, and his anachronistic ideas about how Americans don't know how to live, with lines about commuters being trapped in living rooms that come from poor trees felled by chainsaws, showing here also his background as a logger up north. His voice was deep and resonant and somehow brave, like the voice of old-time American heroes and orators. Something earnest and strong and humanly hopeful I liked about him, while the other poets were either too dainty in their asceticism or too hysterically cynical to hope for anything, or too abstract and indoorsy, or too political, or, like Coughlin, too incomprehensible to understand big Coughlin saying things about unclarified processes, though where Coughlin did say that revelation was a personal thing, I noticed the strong Buddhist and idealistic feeling of Jaffe, which he'd shared with good-hearted Coughlin in their buddy days at college, as I had shared mine with Alva and the Eastern scene, and with others less apocalyptical and straighter, but in no sense more sympathetic and tearful. Meanwhile, scores of people stood around in the darkened gallery, straining to hear every word of the amazing poetry reading, as I wandered from group to group, facing them and facing away from the stage, urging them to glug a slug from the jug, or wandered back and sat on the right side of the stage, giving out little wows and yeses of approval, and even whole sentences of comment with nobody's invitation, but in general gaiety, nobody's disapproval either. It was a great night. Delicate Francis de Pavia read from delicate onion skin, yellow pages, or pink, which he kept flipping carefully with long white fingers, the poems of his dead chum Altman, who'd eaten too much peyote in Chihuahua, or died of polio one, but read none of his own poems, a charming elegy in itself to the memory of the dead young poet, enough to draw tears from the Cervantes of Chapter 7, and read them in a delicate Englishy voice that had me crying with inside laughter, though I later got to know Francis and liked him. Among the people standing in the audience was Rosie Buchanan, a girl with a short haircut, red-haired, bony handsome, a real gone chick and friend of everybody of any consequence on the beach, who'd been a painter's model and a writer herself, and was bubbling over with excitement at the time because she was in love with my old buddy Cody. "Great! Hey, Rosie," I yelled, and she took a big slug from my jug and shined eyes at me. Cody just stood behind her with both arms around her waist. Between poets, Reinhold K. Coates, in his bow tie and shabby old coat, would get up and make a little funny speech in his snide, funny voice and introduce the next reader. But as I say, come 11:30, when all the poems were read and everybody was milling around wondering what had happened and what would come next in American poetry, he was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. And we all got together with him, the poets, and drove in several cars to Chinatown for a big fabulous dinner off the Chinese menu, with chopsticks, yelling conversation in the middle of the night in one of those free-swinging great Chinese restaurants of San Francisco. This happened to be Jaffe's favorite Chinese restaurant, Nam Yuan, and he showed me how to order and how to eat with chopsticks, and told anecdotes about the Zen lunatics of the Orient, and had me going so glad, and we had a bottle of wine on the table, that finally I went over to an old cook in the doorway of the kitchen and asked him, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Bodhidharma was the Indian who brought Buddhism eastward to China. I don't care, said the old cook, with lidded eyes. And I told you, Jaffe, and he said, perfect answer, absolutely perfect. Now you know what I mean by Zen. I had a lot more to learn, too, especially about how to handle girls. Jaffe's incomparable Zen lunatic way, which I got a chance to see firsthand the following week. Chapter 3. In Berkeley, I was living with Alva Goldbook in his little rose-covered cottage in the backyard of a bigger house in Milvia Street. The old rotten porch slanted forward to the ground among vines, with a nice old rocking chair that I sat in every morning to read my Diamond Sutra. The yard was full of tomato plants about to ripen, and mint. Everything smelled of mint, and one fine old tree that I loved to sit under and meditate on those cool, perfect, starry California October nights, unmatched anywhere in the world. We had a perfect little kitchen with a gas stove, but no icebox, but no matter. We also had a perfect little bathroom with a tub and hot water, and one main room covered with pillows and floor mats of straw and mattresses to sleep on, and books, hundreds of books, everything from Catalyst to Pound to Blythe to albums of Bach and Beethoven, and even one swinging Ella Fitzgerald album with Clark Terry, very interesting, on trumpet, and a good 3-speed Weber phonograph that played loud enough to blast the roof off, and the roof nothing but plywood, the walls too, through which one night, in one of our Zen lunatic drunks, I put my fist in glee, and Coughlin saw me and put his head through about 3 inches. About a mile from there, way down Milvia, and then upslope towards the campus of the University of California, behind another big old house on a quiet street, Hillegas, Jaffe lived in his own shack, which was infinitely smaller than ours, about 12 by 12, with nothing in it but typical Jaffe appurtenances, and showed his belief in the simple monastic life. No chairs at all, not even one sentimental rocking chair, but just straw mats. In the corner was his famous rucksack, with cleaned-up pots and pans, all fitting into one another in a compact unit, and all tied and put away inside a knotted-up blue bandana. Then his Japanese wooden pata shoes, which he never used, and a pair of black inside pata socks to pad around softly in over his pretty straw mats. Just room for your 4 toes on one side and your big toe on the other. He had a slew of orange crates, all filled with beautiful scholarly books, some of them in Oriental languages, all the great sutras, comments on sutras, the complete works of D.T. Suzuki, and a fine quadruple volume edition of Japanese haikus. He also had an immense collection of valuable general poetry. In fact, if a thief should have broken in there, the only things of real value were the books. Jaffe's clothes were all old hand-me-downs, bought second-hand with a bemused and happy expression in Goodwill and Salvation Army stores. Wool socks darned, colored undershirts, jeans, work shirts, moccasin shoes, and a few turtleneck sweaters that he wore one on top the other in the cold mountain nights of the high Sierras in California and the high Cascades of Washington and Oregon on the long, incredible jaunts that sometimes lasted weeks and weeks with just a few pounds of dried food in his pack. A few orange crates made his table, on which one late sunny afternoon, as I arrived, was steaming a peaceful cup of tea at his side as he bent his serious head to the Chinese signs of the poet Han Shan. Coughlin had given me the address, and I came there, seeing first Jaffe's bicycle on the lawn in front of the big house out front, where his landlady lived. Then the few odd boulders and rocks and funny little trees he'd brought back from mountain jaunts to set out in his own Japanese tea garden, or tea-house garden, as there was a convenient pine tree soughing over his little domicile. A peacefuller scene I never saw than when, in that rather nippy late red afternoon, I simply opened his little door and looked in and saw him at the end of the little shack, sitting cross-legged on a paisley pillow on a straw mat, with his spectacles on, making him look old and scholarly and wise, with book on lap, and the little tin teapot and porcelain cup steaming at his side. He looked up very peacefully, saw who it was, said, "Ray, come in," and bent his eyes again to the script. "What are you doing?" "Translating Han Chan's great poem called Cold Mountain, written 1,000 years ago, some of it scribbled on the sides of cliffs hundreds of miles away from any other living beings." "Wow! When you come into this house, though you'd got to take your shoes off. See those straw mats? You can ruin them with shoes." So I took off my soft-soled blue cloth shoes off and laid them dutifully by the door, and he threw me a pillow, and I sat cross-legged along the little wooden board wall, and he offered me a cup of hot tea. "Did you ever read the book of tea?" said he. "No, what's that?" "It's a scholarly treatise on how to make tea, utilizing all the knowledge of 2,000 years about tea brewing. Some of the descriptions of the effect of the first sip of tea and the second and the third are really wild and ecstatic. Those guys got high on nothing, hey? Sip your tea and you'll see this is good green tea. It was good, and I immediately felt calm and warm. Want me to read you parts of this Han Shan poem? Want me to tell you about Han Shan? Yeah. Han Shan, you see, was a Chinese scholar who got sick of the big city and the world and took off to hide in the mountains. Say, that sounds like you. In those days, you could really do that. He stayed in caves not far from a Buddhist monastery in the Tiang Hissing district of Tien Tai, and his only human friend was the funny Zen lunatic Shiti, who had a job sweeping out the monastery with a straw broom. Shiti was a poet, too, but he never wrote much down. Every now and then, Han Shan would come down from Cold Mountain in his bark clothing and come into the warm kitchen and wait for food. But none of the monks would ever feed him because he didn't want to join the order and answer the meditation bell 3 times a day. You see why in some of his utterances, like listen and I'll look here and read from the Chinese, and I bent over his shoulder and watched him read from big wild crowd tracks of Chinese signs. Climbing up cold mountain path goes on and on, long gorge choked with scree and boulders, wide creek and mist-blurred grass. Moss is slippery, though there's been no rain, pine sings, but there's no wind. Who can leap the world's ties and sit with me among white clouds? Wow! Of course, that's my own translation into English. You see, there are 5 signs for each line, and I have to put in Western prepositions and articles and such. Why don't you just translate it as it is? 5 signs, 5 words. What's those first 5 signs? Sign for climbing, sign for up, sign for cold, sign for mountain, sign for path. Well then, translate it. Climbing up cold mountain path. Yeah, but what do you do with the sign for long? Sign for gorge, sign for choke, sign for avalanche, sign for boulders. Where's that? That's the 3rd line. Would have read long gorge, choke, avalanche, boulders. Well, that's even better. Well, yeah, I thought of that, but I have to have this pass the approval of Chinese scholars here at the university and have it clear in English. Boy, what a great thing this is, I said, looking around at the little shack. And you sitting here so very quietly at this very quiet hour, studying all alone with your glasses. Ray, what you got to do is go climb a mountain with me soon. How would you like to climb Matterhorn? Great, where's that? Up in the high Sierras. We can go there with Henry Morley in his car and bring our packs and take off from the lake. I could carry all the food and stuff we need in my rucksack, and you could borrow Alva's small knapsack and carry extra socks and shoes and stuff. What's these signs mean? These signs mean that Han Shan came down from the mountain after many years roaming around up there to see his folks in town. Says, till recently I stayed at Cold Mountain, etc. Yesterday I called on friends and family. More than half had gone to the Yellow Springs. That means death. The Yellow Springs. Now morning I face my lone shadow. I can't study with both eyes full of tears. That's like you too, Jaffe, studying with eyes full of tears. My eyes aren't full of tears. Aren't they going to be after a long time? They certainly will, Ray. And look here. In the mountains it's cold. It's always been cold, not just this year, see? He's real high, maybe 12,000 or 13,000 feet or more, way up there, and says jagged scarps always snowed in, woods in the dark ravines spitting mist, grass is still sprouting at the end of June, leaves begin to fall in early August, and here I am, high as a junkie. As a junkie. That's my own translation. He actually says, here I am as high as the sensualist in the city below. But I made it modern and high translation. Great! I wondered why Han Shan was Jaffe's hero. Because, he said, he was a poet, a mountain man, a Buddhist dedicated to the principle of meditation on the essence of all things. A vegetarian, too. By the way, though, I haven't got on that kick from figuring maybe in this modern world to be a vegetarian is to split hairs a little, since all sentient beings eat what they can. And he was a man of solitude who could take off by himself and live purely and true to himself. That sounds like you too. And like you too, Ray. I haven't forgotten what you told me about how you made it in the woods meditating in North Carolina and all. Jaffe was very sad, subdued. I'd never seen him so quiet. Melancholy, thoughtful, his voice was as tender as a mother's. He seemed to be talking from far away to a poor yearning creature, me, who needed to hear his message. He wasn't putting anything on. He was in a bit of a trance. Have you been meditating today? Yeah, I meditate first thing in the morning before breakfast, and I always meditate a long time in the afternoon unless I'm interrupted. Who interrupts you? Oh, people. Coughlin sometimes, and Alva came yesterday, and Raul Sturluson. And I got this girl comes over to play Yabyum. Yabyum? What's that? Don't you know about Yabyum, Smith? I'll tell you later. He seemed to be too sad to talk about Yabyum, which I found out about a couple of nights later. We talked a while longer about Han Shan and poems on cliffs, and as I was going away, his friend Raul Sturluson, a tall, blond, good-looking kid, came in to discuss his coming trip to Japan with him. This Raul Sturluson was interested in the famous Ryojin rock garden of Shokuji Monastery in Kyoto, which is nothing but old boulders placed in such a way supposedly mystically aesthetic as to cause thousands of tourists and monks every year to journey there to stare at the boulders in the sand and thereby gain peace of mind. I have never met such weird yet serious and earnest people. I never saw Roll Sturluson again. He went to Japan soon after, but I can't forget what he said about the boulders. To my question, well, who placed them in that certain way? That's so great. Nobody knows, some monk or monks long ago. But there is a definite mysterious form in the arrangement of the rocks. It's only through form that we can realize emptiness. He showed me the picture of the boulders in well-raked sand, looking like islands in the sea, looking as though they had eyes, declivities, and surrounded by a neatly screened and architectural monastery patio. Then he showed me a diagram of the stone arrangement with the projection in silhouette, and showed me the geometrical logics and all, and mentioned the phrases lonely, individuality, and the rocks as bumps pushing into space, all meaning some kind of cone business. I wasn't as much interested in as in him, and especially in good kind Jaffe, who brewed more tea on his noisy gasoline primus, and gave us added cups with almost a silent oriental bow. It was quite different from the night of the poetry reading. 4. But the next night, about midnight, Coughlin and I and Elva got together and decided to buy a big gallon jug of Burgundy and go bust in on Jaffe in his shack. "What's he doing tonight?" I asked. "Oh," says Coughlin, "probably studying, probably screwing. We'll go see." We bought the jug on Shattuck Avenue, way down, and went over, and once more I saw his pitiful English bicycle on the lawn. Jaffe travels around on that bicycle with his little knapsack on his back, all up and down Berkeley all day, said Coughlin. He used to do the same things at Reed College, in Oregon. He was a regular fixture up there. Then we'd throw big wine parties and have girls and end up jumping out of windows and playing Joe College pranks all up and down town. "Gee, he's strange," said Alva, biting his lip in a mood of marvel, and Alva himself was making a careful, interested study of our strange, noisy, quiet friend. We came in the little door again. Jaffe looked up from his cross-legged study over a book, American poetry this time, glasses on, and said nothing but "Ah" in a strangely cultured tone. We took off our shoes and padded across the little 5 feet of straw to sit by him, but I was the last with my shoes off, and had the jug in my hand, which I turned to show him from across the shack. And from his cross-legged position, Jaffe suddenly roared, "Yeah!" and leaped up into the air and straight across the room to me, landing on his feet in a fencing position with a sudden dagger in his hand, the tip of it just barely stabbing the glass of the bottle with a small distinct clink. It was the most amazing leap I ever saw in my life, except by nutty acrobats, much like a mountain goat, which he was, it turned out. Also, it reminded me of a Japanese samurai warrior. The yelling roar, the leap, the position, and his expression of comic wrath in his eyes, bulging and making a big funny face at me. I had the feeling it was really a complaint against our breaking in on his studies, and against wine itself, which would get him drunk and make him miss his planned evening of reading. But without further ado, he uncapped the bottle himself and took a big slug, and we all sat cross-legged and spent 4 hours screaming news at one another. One of the funniest nights. Some of it went on like this. Jaffe. Well, Coughlin, you old fart, what you been doing? Coughlin. Nothing. Alva. What are all these strange books here? Pound. Do you like Pound? Jaffe. Except for the fact that the old fart-face flubbed up the name of Li Po by calling him his Japanese name and all such famous twaddle, he was all right. In fact, he's my favorite poet. Ray. Pound? Who wants to make a favorite poet out of that pretentious nut? Jaffe. Have some more wine, Smith. You're not making sense. Who is your favorite poet, Alva? Ray. Why don't somebody ask me my favorite poet? I know more about poetry than all of you put together. Jaffe. Is that true? Alva. It might be. Haven't you seen Ray's new book of poems he just wrote in Mexico? The wheel of the quivering meat conception turns in the void, expelling ticks, porcupines, elephants, people, stardust, fools, nonsense. Ray. That's not it. Jaffe. Speaking of meat, have you read the new poem of etc., etc.? Then finally disintegrating into a wild talk-fest and yell-fest and finally song-fest, with people rolling on the floor in laughter and ending with Alva and Coughlin and I going staggering up the quiet college street, arm in arm, singing Eli, Eli at the top of our voices and dropping the empty jug right at our feet in a crash of glass, as Jaffe laughed from his little door. But we'd made him miss his evening of study, and I felt bad about that, till the following night, when he suddenly appeared at our little cottage with a pretty girl and came in and told her to take her clothes off, which she did at once. Chapter 5. This was in keeping with Jaffe's theories about women and lovemaking. I forgot to mention that the day the rock artist had called on him in the late afternoon, a girl had come right after, a blonde in rubber boots and a Tibetan coat with wooden buttons, and in the general talk she'd inquired about our plan to climb Mount Matterhorn, and said, "Can I come with ya?" as she was a bit of a mountain climber herself. "Sure," said Jaffe in his funny voice he used for joking, a big, loud, deep imitation of a lumberjack he knew in the Northwest. A ranger, actually, old Bernie Byers. "Sure, come on with us, and we'll all screw you at 10,000 feet." And the way he said it was so funny and casual, and in fact serious, that the girl wasn't shocked at all, but somewhat pleased. In this same spirit, he'd now brought this girl, Princess, to our cottage. It was about 8 o'clock at night, dark. Alva and I were quietly sipping tea and reading poems or typing poems at the typewriter, and 2 bicycles came in the yard. Jaffe on his, Princess on hers. Princess had gray eyes and yellow hair, and was very beautiful, and only 20. I must say one thing about her. She was sex mad and mad and man mad. so there wasn't much of a problem in persuading her to play Yab Yum. "Don't you know about Yab Yum, Smith?" said Jaffe, in his big booming voice, striding in his boots, holding Princess's hand. "Princess and I come here to show you, boy." "Suits me," I said, "whatever it is." Also, I'd known Princess before, and had been mad about her in the city about a year ago. It was just another wild coincidence that she had happened to meet Jaffe and fallen in love with him, and madly too. She'd do anything he said. Whenever people dropped in to visit us at the cottage, I'd always put my red bandana over the little wall lamp and put out the ceiling light to make a nice, cool, red dim scene to sit and drink wine and talk in. I did this, and went to get the bottle out of the kitchen, and couldn't believe my eyes when I saw Jaffe and Alva taking their clothes off and throwing them every which way. And I looked, and Princess was stark naked, her skin white as snow, when the red sun hits it at dusk in the dim red light. "What the hell?" I said. "Here's what Yab Yum is, Smith," said Jaffe, and he sat cross-legged on the pillow on the floor, motioned to Princess, who came over and sat down on him, facing him with her arms about his neck, and they sat like that, saying nothing for a while. Jaffe wasn't at all nervous and embarrassed, and just sat there in perfect form, just as he was supposed to do. This is what they do in the temples of Tibet. It's a holy ceremony. It's done just like this in front of chanting priests. People pray and recite Om Mani Padme Hum, which means Amen, the thunderbolt in the dark void. I'm the thunderbolt, and Princess is the dark void. You see? "But what's she thinking?" I yelled, almost in despair. I'd had such idealistic longings for that girl in the past year, and had conscience-stricken hours wondering if I should seduce her because she was so young and all. "Oh, this is lovely," said Princess. "Come on and try it." "But I can't sit cross-legged like that." Jaffe was sitting in the full lotus position, it's called, with both ankles over both thighs. Alva was sitting on the mattress, trying to yank his ankles over his thighs to do it. Finally, Jaffe's legs began to hurt, and they just tumbled over on the mattress, where both Alva and Jaffe began to explore the territory. I still couldn't believe it. "Take your clothes off and join in, Smith." But on top of all that, the feelings about Princess, I'd also gone through an entire year of celibacy based on my feeling that lust was the direct cause of birth, which was the direct cause of suffering and death, and I had really, no lie, come to a point where I regarded lust as offensive and even cruel. "Pretty girls make graves," was my saying, whenever I'd had to turn my head around involuntarily to stare at the incomparable pretties of Indian Mexico. And the absence of active lust in me had also given me a new peaceful life, and I was enjoying a great deal. But this was too much. I was still afraid to take my clothes off. Also, I never liked to do that in front of more than one person, especially with men around. But Jaffe didn't give a goddamn hoot and holler about any of this, and pretty soon he was making Princess happy, and then Alva had a turn, with his big serious eyes staring in the dim light, and him reading poems a minute ago. So I said, "How about me starting to work on her arm?" "Go ahead, great," which I did, lying down on the floor with all my clothes on and kissing her hand, then her wrist, then up to her body, as she laughed and almost cried with delight, everybody everywhere working on her. All the peaceful celibacy of my Buddhism was going down the drain. "Smith, I distrust any kind of Buddhism or any kind of philosophy or social system that puts down sex," said Jaffe, quite scholarly, now that he was done and sitting naked, cross-legged, rolling himself a Bull Durham cigarette, which he did as part of his simplicity life. It ended up with everybody naked and finally making gay pots of coffee in the kitchen, and Princess on the kitchen floor naked with her knees clasped in her arms, lying on her side, just for nothing. Just to do it. Then finally she and I took a warm bath together in the bathtub and could hear Alva and Jaffe discussing Zen free love lunacy orgies in the other room. "Hey, Princess, we'll do this every Thursday night, hey?" yelled Jaffe. "It'll be a regular function." "Yeah," yelled Princess from the bathtub. "I'm telling you, she was actually glad to do all this and told me, I feel like I'm the mother of all things and I have to take care of my little children." "You're such a young pretty thing yourself." "But I'm the old mother of Earth. I'm the Bodhisattva." She was just a little bit off her nut, but when I heard her say Bodhisattva, I realized she was wanting to be a big Buddhist like Jaffe, and being a girl, the only way she could express it was this way, which had its traditional roots in the Yabyum ceremony of Tibetan Buddhism, so everything was fine. Alva was immensely pleased and was all for the idea of every Thursday night, and so was I by now. "Alva, Princess says she's the Bodhisattva." "Of course she is. She says she's the mother of all of us." "The Bodhisattva women of Tibet and parts of ancient India," said Jaffe, "were taken and used as holy concubines in temples and sometimes in ritual caves, and would get to lay up a stock of merit, and they meditated too. All of them, men and women, they'd meditate, fast, have balls like this, go back to eating, drinking, talking, hike around, live in viharas in the rainy season, and outdoors in the dry. There was no question of what to do about sex, which is what I always liked about Oriental religion. And what I always dug about the Indians in our country, when I was a little kid in Oregon, I didn't feel that I was an American at all. With all that suburban ideal and sex repression, the general dreary newspaper gray censorship of all our real human values. But when I discovered Buddhism and all, I suddenly felt that I had lived in a previous lifetime innumerable ages ago, and now, because of faults and sins in that lifetime, I was being degraded to a more grievous domain of existence, and my karma was to be born in America, where nobody has any fun or believes in anything, especially freedom. That's why I was always sympathetic to freedom movements too, like anarchism in the Northwest, the old-time heroes of Everett Massacre, and all. It ended up with long, earnest discussions about all these subjects, and finally Princess got dressed and went home with Jaffe on their bicycles and Alva, and I sat facing each other in the dim red light. But Ray, Jaffe is really sharp. He's really the wildest, craziest, sharpest cat we've ever met. And what I love about him is he's the big hero of the West Coast. Do you realize I've been out here for 2 years now and hadn't met anybody worth knowing really, or anybody with any truly illuminated intelligence, and was giving up hope for the West Coast. Besides, all the background he has in Oriental scholarship, pound-taking, peyote, and seeing visions, his mountain climbing, and haikyuing. Wow! Jaffe Ryder is a great new hero of American culture. He's mad. I agreed. And other things I like about him, his quiet sad moments when he don't say much. Gee, I wonder what will happen to him in the end. I think he'll end up like Han Shan, living alone in the mountains and writing poems on the walls of cliffs, or chanting them to crowds outside his cave. Or maybe he'll go to Hollywood and be a movie star. He said that the other day. He said, "Alva, I've never thought of going to the movies and becoming a star. I can do anything, I haven't tried, and yet..." And I believe him. He can do anything. Did you see the way he had Princess all wrapped around him? Aye, indeed, and later that night was Alva. As Alva slept, I sat under the tree in the yard and looked up at the stars, or closed my eyes to meditate and tried to quiet myself down to my normal self. Alva couldn't sleep and came out and lay flat on his back in the grass, looking up at the sky, and said, "Big steamy clouds going by in the dark up there. It makes me realize we live on an actual planet. Close your eyes and you'll see more than that." "Oh, I don't know what you mean by all that," he said, pettishly. He was always being bugged by my little lectures on samadhi, ecstasy, which is the state you reach when you stop everything and stop your mind, and you actually, with your eyes closed, see a kind of eternal multiswarm of electrical power of some kind ululating in place of just pitiful images and forms of objects, which are, after all, imaginary. And if you don't believe me, come back in a billion years and deny it. For what is time? Don't you think it's much more interesting just to be like Jaffe and have girls and studies and good times and really be doing something than all this silly sitting under trees? Nope, I said, and meant it. And I knew Jaffe would agree with me. All Jaffe's doing is amusing himself in the void. I don't think so. I bet he is. I'm going mountain climbing with him next week and find out and tell you. Well, sigh. As for me, I'm just going to go on being Alva Goldbrook. And to hell with all this Buddhist bullshit. You'll be sorry someday. Why don't you ever understand what I'm trying to tell you? It's with your six senses that you're fooled into believing not only that you have six senses, but that you contact an actual outside world with them. If it wasn't for your eyes, you wouldn't see me. If it wasn't for your ears, you wouldn't hear that airplane. If it wasn't for your nose, you wouldn't smell the midnight mint. If it wasn't for your tongue taster, you wouldn't taste the difference between A and B. If it wasn't for your body, you wouldn't feel princess. There is no me, no airplane, no mind, no princess, no nothing. You, for Christ's sakes, do you want to go on being fooled every damn minute of your life? Yes, that's all I want. I thank God that something has come out of nothing. Well, I got news for you. It's the other way around. Nothing has come out of something, and that something is Dharmakaya. The body of the true meaning, and that nothing, is this, and all this twaddle and talk. I'm going to bed. Well, sometimes I see a flash of illumination in what you're trying to say, but believe me, I get more of a satori out of princess than out of words. It's a satori of your foolish flesh, you lecher. I know my Redeemer liveth. What Redeemer, and what liveth? Oh, let's cut this out and just live. Balls! When I thought like you, Alva, I was just as miserable and graspy as you are now. All you want to do is run out there and get laid and get beat up and get screwed up and get old and sick and banged around by samsara. You fucking eternal meat of comeback. You'll deserve it too. I'll say. That's not nice. Everybody's tearful and trying to live with what they got. Your Buddhism has made you mean, Ray, and makes you even afraid to take your clothes off for a simple, healthy orgy. Well, I did finally, didn't I? But you were coming on so hintsy about it. Oh, let's forget it. Alva went to bed, and I sat and closed my eyes and thought, this thinking has stopped. But because I had to think it, no thinking had stopped. But there did come over me a wave of gladness to know that all this perturbation was just a dream, already ended, and I didn't have to worry because I wasn't. And I prayed that God, or Tathagata, would give me enough time and enough sense and strength to be able to tell people what I knew, as I can't even do properly now, so they'd know what I know and not despair so much. The old tree brooded over me silently, a living thing. I heard a mouse snoring in the garden weeds. The rooftops of Berkeley looked like pitiful living meat, sheltering grieving phantoms from the eternality of the heavens, which they feared to face. By the time I went to bed, I wasn't taken in by no princess or no desire for no princess and nobody's disapproval, and I felt glad and slept well.